My earliest memories are noise. The clink of cutlery at perfectly arranged dinners, my mother's laugh when Tyler walked into the room, the way attention narrowed to him like a spotlight. I remember learning to compare myself to a shadow. When I was 7, I painted a picture of a field of yellow daisies and walked it into the kitchen, heart pounding with pride. My mother glanced at it and asked, "Did Tyler finish his science fair project?" My father handed Tyler a new bike for winning a little league game the next week. I learned quickly that my accomplishments could be acknowledged only in relation to his. At 13, Tyler brought home an A+ and a trophy, and my parents threw a party. I baked cupcakes for them all. Nobody asked how I'd done in school. At 15, when I got into a program that would have helped pay for college, my mother said, "You should be grateful for what you have." Not, "Congratulations." Not, "We're proud." The lesson stuck. Joy for Tyler, silence for me. I met Jake among the spines of used books. He was the only person who read me without judgment. He liked how I organized the poetry shelf, how I'd recommend a book and then disappear to listen to a stranger laugh at the back table. He had a crooked smile and hands that smelled like motor oil from his night shifts. I loved him because he made the world softer. Our first apartment was a walk-up above a laundromat, 2 rooms no one would write home about. We learned to dance in the kitchen around a stack of unpaid bills. We learned the rhythm of making little stretch into more. Both working, both saving, both promising that one day we'd trade the tiny apartment for something with a proper window. We planned and scraped. When I fell pregnant, we cried and laughed at the same time. Scared, thrilled, convinced we'd do right by our child no matter what. The hospital room was white and humming and filled with the small, extraordinary noises of birth. When the nurse placed him in my arms, he smelled like soap and milk and all the impossible things I could not yet name. "Jake," I whispered, "he's perfect." He was. The first week was a blur of feeding schedules and terrible love. I learned his little noises. I learned the timbre of his weight against my chest. I nursed him half asleep and thought, for a dangerously short time, that everything fragile in the world could be mended by the 2 of us. At 6 weeks we went for the routine checkup. I had a diaper bag full of hope and a stomach full of exhaustion. The pediatrician's face, usually warm, sank. "We need tests," she said. "Now." Her words were careful but immediate. The air in the exam room narrowed. Machines, then a doctor who used phrases like, "congenital defect," "urgent," "surgery." The doctor's voice kept providing facts and appointments as if the machine of her expression could not cope with the incomprehensible. On the phone to my mother I said, "We can't do this alone. He needs surgery." Her reply was a calm that felt like someone closing a door in my chest. "We just bought Tyler a house. We can't do that." For a moment I didn't understand. The words existed but meant nothing in my throat. My baby's heartbeat felt hot beneath my fingers. My mother's voice was colder than I'd ever heard. It hit me like a falling object. They had made a deliberate choice. This wasn't an absent-minded oversight. My parents had prioritized one child's comfort, Tyler's house, his new car, his dinners paid for, over the life of a newborn. I spent the week in a daze. Bills became an avalanche. Banks answered me with sympathy and a stack of requirements. Family members sent vague notes about difficult times. Tyler posted a photo of him leaning on a balcony, champagne in hand, the new house's modern rail behind him. The contrast was obscene. My son was hooked into monitors. My brother posted filters. We tried everything. Bank loans rejected us for insufficient history. Crowdfunding brought in kindness from strangers but not nearly enough. I watched the donation counter as often as I watched my son's oxygen saturations. Night after night I sat in the hospital with Jake, watching doctors speak in clipped sentences about contingencies and risks. Jake's jaw clenched, His knuckles turned white around my hand. "We'll figure this out," he kept saying. I wanted to believe him. I had to. There were moments of unbearable helplessness. The kind that make you feel like the ground has been cut away and the sky is only a rumor. I had never felt so alone despite the hospital being full of people. The spark came unexpectedly. It was a small, spiteful thing at first. I resented their tastefully framed family photos, their practice of presenting Tyler's accomplishments as a shared triumph. The resentment grew like a plant in winter sunlight. I started to look for patterns. Tyler's birthday gift was never wrapped in simple paper. My parents had received checks from a company that never sent goods. I started asking questions in gentle ways. Casual phone conversations that turned into careful notes. My resentment became a ledger. "This is what you've done," I told myself. "You'll make them answer." It was the only armor I could fashion from the raw materials of rage and exhaustion. I had no background in finances, but I had a fierce willingness, and a little knowledge from years of paying attention. I took nights to teach myself what I could about trusts, joint accounts, and how houses are often paid off behind a paper trail of shell accounts and loans. I reached out quietly to an old college friend who worked in accounting. She offered a referral to a private investigator who owed her a favor. The investigator was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a moral code that made him the perfect partner. He dug into parcels of bank statements and found patterns. Transfer after transfer. Small installments disguised as gifts. At the same time, I found a sympathetic lawyer who took an initial meeting pro bono, looking at this from the angle of unjust enrichment and breach of fiduciary duty. It was legal jargon at first, but it became a language I could use. Hospital waiting rooms became my war rooms. I thumbed through printed bank statements, scrolled on my phone, talked in whispers to my investigator between shifts. I started building a case not out of hatred, but out of the desperate clarity that if I did not act, nothing would change. Jake sat through these long nights and held my hand while I compiled spreadsheets. He drew charts on napkins. He learned to read my investigator's emails. He was my anchor. When I felt wobbly, I looked at him and saw that we were still two people fighting to give our son a life. Chapter 10, The Operation. The day of the surgery is a drip of time that never quite dries. I remember the antiseptic smell, the bright lights, the thousand small instructions. I signed forms that made my hands sweat. Jake squeezed my hand in the pre-op room. We tried to make jokes that landed like thin paper boats on still water. Then they took him into the theater and we were left in a corridor full of other people's fears. Hours stretched. When the surgeon finally came out, his face was careful. "He's stable," he said. "We did everything we could." We cried then, an odd, terrible sound that fused relief and anger into something combustible. He survived. For that I am forever grateful. But surviving didn't erase the knowledge that my parents had chosen differently. After the surgery, while my son recovered in PICU, my strategy hardened. I wasn't going to reduce my fight to a social media rant or an impulsive confrontation. I methodically collated documents. Receipts, transfers, screenshots of Tyler's social posts showing gifts and new furniture, bank notices reported by our investigator. I took everything to the lawyer. Accounts with unrecorded transfers, shell entities, money labeled as loan forgiveness. The lawyer darkened his brows and said, "This is more than favoritism. If this is what I'm seeing, there are legal avenues." The plan split into two tracks. Legal, subpoena, freezing assets and civil litigation, and social, controlled leaks, ensuring the public would understand the moral stakes. We filed initial motions quietly. The legal system moved like a freight train. Slow at first, then unstoppable. Subpoenas were issued for account records. The court approved temporary orders to prevent sale or transfer of certain assets. In the background, the private investigator continued to collect corroboration. Tyler's house, for a moment, was an abstract concept on a paper docket. Then it became the most concrete, demoralized piece of real estate in our small world. A property encumbered by legal scrutiny. Going public was not something I wanted lightly. I didn't crave drama. I craved accountability. We controlled the narrative. I provided key facts to a local investigative journalist who had covered consumer fraud. She approached the story carefully, corroborated documents, and wrote a clear piece about nepotistic finances and the moral rot of privileging show over substance. I posted a short statement on my personal account. No vitriol, only facts. Screenshots, court filings, then a calm, painful line. My son needed surgery. I asked my parents for help. They refused. They just bought my brother a house. The response was instantaneous and sharp. People recognized the cruelty. My inbox filled with messages, not just donations which swelled the fund for my son's recovery, but also similar stories from people who had been sidelined by parents for years. The story resonated. Public exposure is a double-edged sword. Some of my mother's friends and Tyler's acquaintances posted defensive comments. Family is complicated. My mother called, voice cracking like thin ice, insisting the house was alone. My father repeated in a phone call, the same line I'd heard before. You knew what you were getting into. But there was also fierce support. A woman whose husband worked as a nurse offered emotional advice about the PICU. A neighbor organized a meal schedule. The donations helped pay rehab therapists and specialized formula. The community rallied in unexpected ways. The court docket, however, kept moving. Temporary restraints placed on assets sent a shock through family circles. Tyler posted a stoic photo and then less often. The comments turned from smug to defensive. This is private, one neighbor wrote. Why make it public? Another asked. But the journalist's piece had already tilted public sentiment. We organized a family meeting under the pretext of trying to talk things through. I wanted them to look at the faces they'd harmed. I wanted them to see guilt without filters. I walked into the living room with a thick folder of evidence. My hands didn't shake as much as I expected. I laid out transfers, dates, and tiny notes that the investigator had compiled. Transfer 412/gift labeled for Tyler's home improvements. Wire origin, mother's account. He had added a little notation where the same account had a withdrawal after the date of our phone call. My mother's color drained slowly. My father, who always tried to look larger than he was, suddenly seemed small. Tyler's jaw tightened. You financed that house? I asked, voice quiet but steel true. Tyler's answer was a string of excuses. I manage my own money, he said. They helped me because they could. My mother defended herself by saying it had always been family support. My father muttered about wisdom and stability. I didn't shout. I unrolled their actions in front of everyone like a map. I showed the transfers, the dates that coincided with my son's hospital admissions. I watched as recognition spread across their faces. The precise, hot recognition of guilt. The humiliation they felt was real. It wasn't my pleasure to humiliate them, but accountability is not the same as cruelty. The court moved from temporary orders to more serious claims. The bank accounts that had seemed opaque were now under scrutiny. Tyler called me in the middle of the night once, voice raw. I didn't know the details. I swear. I listened and then carefully I said, I don't know if I believe you. But I don't need you to defend them for me. We were no longer family in the warm, shared silver sense. There was a fracture that law and publicity had made a clean cut. My parents' social circle drew back. Invitations dried up. Some of their friends called to say they'd been unaware. Others simply stopped returning calls. In private, my father would sit in his den and watch the evening news. The face of someone who'd always been the giver now had to deal with being the subject of ethical scrutiny. Money that had once seemed invincible suddenly felt fragile. Lenders called. The house could not be sold. Luxury items were temporary collateral in legal equations. My parents faced legal fees and public disgrace. The stooped shoulders of a woman who always fashioned the perfect dinner now had to face the kind of shame no ribbon could hide. I confess there were nights when I lay awake and worried I had gone too far. Had I destroyed a family? Was revenge the same as justice? I thought of my son's small heart beating under the piku light and told myself that the question had already been answered by their choices. With the legal tug-of-war underway, I focused on the practical. My son needed therapy, monitoring, and a sense of normalcy. We set up a trust fund in his name, placed assets where they would be protected, and invested in his long-term care. We spoke to pediatric cardiologists who specialized in follow-up. I cut financial ties with my parents and did not accept apologies that came wrapped in guilt. Jake and I moved out of the old apartment into a modest place closer to the hospital where we'd spent so many nights. Our lives were reworked around medical appointments and school scheduling. We learned new rhythms. We learned to laugh again in small ways. Over burnt coffee, an impromptu Sunday walk, the tiny gummy smile our son gave when he dropped food on his shirt. Tyler, who'd always been so sure of the world's favors, began to unravel. Without the safety net, his charm looked threadbare. He tried to pivot his public persona, blaming family dynamics, and promising to make amends. But the public had already judged the architecture of his privilege. Friends who had once accepted his entitlement now kept distance. He lost some of his swagger. There were quieter, lonelier photos. A birthday passed with fewer guests. I did not gloat. I watched with a studied calm as consequences ran their course. The law, not me, had taken back its due. Months later I confronted my parents again, this time not with evidence but with a question. Why? Why had they chosen a house over a life? My mother cried then. Not the sharp performative tears for public cameras, but messy, private sobs. She said things about fear, image, the pressure they'd felt to present a perfect family. My father, usually a man of a stoic face, said, "We thought we were securing a legacy." It sounded like an excuse and an explanation, and neither satisfied me. "You bought him security," I said. "You withheld our son's life." The room spun with the weight of what had been done. Accountability had arrived. But whether forgiveness could be manufactured from their grief was another matter. I believed then, more than ever, that love, when conditional, needed limits. Legal settlements eventually landed in our inboxes. Complicated, practical, and not perfect. Tyler's assets were reduced. My parents faced fines and a legal obligation to reallocate funds. No amount of money undid the months of hospital fear, but the settlement prevented protracted litigation that would have cost time, energy, and more damage. We accepted the settlement mostly because it allowed us to focus on rebuilding rather than endless court battles. More importantly, it meant our son's needs could be met with less uncertainty. The publicity dimmed. Life returned to quieter hums. The real victory was private. One morning I watched my son at the park, chasing a kite with a laugh that spread through me like sunlight. His scar was a faint line now, a quiet reminder rather than a constant ache. He didn't know the politics that had saved him. He only knew that his mother was there and his father was laughing at his bad kite flying. I found a strange peace in the small domestic seasons. The smell of pancakes on a Saturday, homework finales, and quiet evenings with Jake where we traced dreams that no longer resembled those we'd planned at 25 but felt steadier for it. There are moments when revenge can feel cheap and moments when it feels necessary. For me, making them accountable was less about gloating than survival. It meant that other mothers, other children, might face a slightly fairer accounting in families where appearance often beats compassion. I did not wish for my parents to be destitute. I wished only that the moral ledger reflect what had happened. The law did more than I could on its own. It made space for a truth that words alone would not. In the months after the legal resolution, I received a letter from Tyler. A handwritten page full of awkward apologies. He wrote about not knowing, about pressure, about friends who told him relinquishing the house wasn't the end of the world. I folded the letter away and kept it in a drawer. I replied with a short note, "You were chosen by them. I was chosen by my son." Live with that. It was a small closure. I did not expect hugs or tears. I expected life. Years later, the wounds had healed enough that the scars looked like lines on a map I could now read. Jake and I sat at a kitchen table with coffee rings and college brochures. Our son, older and louder, announced suddenly and poetically that he wanted to be an artist one day. "You'll be brilliant," I said, because I had been one of the quiet children once and wanted him to hear praise without a comparison. We had built something small and honest. No mansions. No social glossy appearances. Just a house with a front step that held our shoes and a backyard where we planted tomatoes. Justice had been done. Revenge had been a tool, a hard one, but not the only thing I took away. I took strength, clarity, and the knowledge that I would always protect the small, fragile things I loved. When I brush my son's hair and kiss his forehead at night now, I still hear that tiny distant machine beat sound echoing in memory. It will always be there, a reminder of what almost was and what I fought to keep. People sometimes ask if I regret how far I pushed. The answer is complicated. I regret that our family broke. I do not regret the decision to make them account for their choices. What I regret less is nothing compared to what I gained. A life where my child is safe, a future I chose rather than inherited, and a lesson carved deep, that love without limits can be destructive, and that sometimes justice demands action. And yes, revenge came, slow as winter thaw and precise as an audit. Changed them. It saved my son. It saved me.